A lot of the people we remember were people who were executed in the Cold War, the Rosenbergs, or Sacco and Vanzetti in the 1920s. Somehow being executed, especially for a political crime, elevates your importance, whether one agrees with them or not. What if John Brown had been killed at Harper's Ferry, which was perfectly possible, obviously. He was wounded. He could have easily been killed. It was not a very successful operation. Probably he wouldn't have been as much of a martyr. And a lot of the impact of John Brown's raid comes because he becomes a martyr in the North, and Southerners become more and more angry at the celebration of John Brown in the North. So, on the other hand, even if he had died, it would have had some impact, because Brown's raid exemplified a fear Southerners have had all through this period of Northern abolitionists trying to stir up a slave rebellion. You know, I found this also with the fugitive slaves. It's interesting. When Southerners talk about fugitive slaves, the Southerners had a vested interest in exaggerating, you might almost say, the Underground Railroad. They saw it because they didn't think slaves wanted to run away on their own. They thought the slaves were happy, contented. Why did they run away? Because Northern agitators are kind of warping the minds of the slaves. There's this vast network of agents. That's ridiculous. There was no such thing. Trying to get slaves to run away. Slaves ran away on their own. When they got to the North, they got help. But it was not the fault of Northern abolitionists that slaves ran away. And similarly, but the notion that you needed an outside force to make slaves, resist, that was a feature of Southern thought. And John Brown exemplified, here was their nightmare come true, a Northern abolitionist with guns, with 20 other people, actually trying to spark off a slave revolution. So even if he had been killed, even if he hadn't been executed, it would have stirred a lot of fear in the South. So, but I think the execution did a lot to make him a major figure of that period.
How about someone from South Carolina, the secession crisis?
Hello.
In your book, you argue that Lincoln originally unwaveringly insisted on the permanence of the Union. So if so, why do you believe that he refused to compromise on the expansion of slavery when it could have prevented the South Carolina secession? Or do you think that South Carolina
That's a great question.
was already hooked on secession?
That is, all right, let's repeat the question.
Sorry.
The question was, if Lincoln was so devoted to the preservation of the Union, which he was, why did he refuse to compromise with South Carolina and other states when the secession crisis took place? That's the question. That is a great question, and I often throw that question back at people when I lecture about Lincoln, which I do many places all over the place. Lincoln is a kind of perennial interest in this country, as you all know. When people say, well, all Lincoln cared about was the Union, he didn't really care about slavery. He just, emancipation came because it was militarily needed or something. I say exactly what you just said. Well, if that's the case, he could have easily saved the Union and avoided the Civil War by just giving in to what the South wanted. No problem. Give them what they want. If you don't care about slavery, what difference does it make if slavery expands or not? Lincoln adamantly, as I wrote, and you said, opposed compromise on that issue. That issue, the expansion of slavery. He said, by the way, the fugitive slave issue was important in the secession crisis. Lincoln said, I don't care what we do. We can compromise on that. No problem. No problem what we do. But on the westward expansion of slavery, no. Why? Why wouldn't he? First of all, I think it shows that the Union was not the only value to Lincoln. To say he wanted the preservation of the Union is true, but it is not true to say that's all he cared about. Lincoln once said, we must save the Union, but it must be a Union worth saving. If we give up the principle of the Union, which to Lincoln was freedom, or the promise of freedom, then it's not. Then what's the point of saving the Union? So, but also, Lincoln said that, look, I've just been elected on a platform the core of which is stopping the expansion of slavery. That's what the Republican Party stood for. It was not an abolitionist party. It wasn't demanding the end of slavery. It was demanding stopping the westward expansion of slavery. If we now give up the principle on which we were elected because of threats, what happens to democracy? What kind of democracy is that, where the winning party must surrender in order to take office? And he said, if that happens, they'll be back next year. They'll say, we're going to secede unless you annex Cuba. We're going to secede unless you reopen the African slave trade. To compromise with, or to give in to threats will just lead to more and more and more of the same. So, as he says somewhere in the secession crisis, the tug has come. The tug, the fight, this is the moment. We have to either give in or stand up. So Lincoln did not cause the Civil War individually, but Lincoln was willing to risk war in order to preserve that principle. He was willing, he knew that war was a possible outcome. And he wasn't, so I think the answer to your question is Lincoln cared about the saving of the Union, but that was not the only thing he cared about, and he wasn't willing to give up everything else he believed in order to accommodate South Carolina. Now, it's also true, as I said in the book, that Lincoln, I think, had an unrealistic assessment of how strong secession sentiment was in the South. He thought that he overestimated the number of white Southerners who were still loyal to the Union. He thought secession was a minority, movement, and that it would fall apart by itself. In other words, not compromising is not just a decision for war. There's another possible alternative, which is secession collapsing from within. That's what Lincoln thought would happen. Of course, that's not what happened, and he probably vastly overestimated the number of Southerners who were opposed to secession. But that's another reason he didn't feel the need to compromise on this particular issue.
So let's just go back a little bit. Two people are writing about Cooper Union's.
Oh, yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, Ms. Joe.
Do you want to stand up so I can hear you better?
I just wanted to know if you agreed with Mr. Harold Holzer that Cooper Union was the main, catalyst for Lincoln becoming president.
Harold Holtz is a good friend of mine, so I agree with everything he says. It was a catalyst. The Cooper Union speech, one thing that everyone must realize about Lincoln is he was a very savvy politician. Lincoln was a politician. That was what he loved, politics. I say that just because today, I'm not talking about any particular person or party. Generally speaking, politicians are held in low esteem today. I saw a public opinion poll, Gallup poll a few years ago, where people were asked to rank different occupations and groups in terms of whether they admired them, and politicians came out third from the bottom. The only groups below politicians were convicted felons and Wall Street bankers. But back at that time, politicians were greatly admired. They were loved. Lincoln loved Henry Clay. It's hard to imagine. Henry Clay? Lincoln, he said he's my ideal. Millions of people loved Henry Clay. They loved Andrew Jackson. They eventually loved Lincoln. So Lincoln is a shrewd politician. And the Cooper Union speech, by the time he gives that speech, February 1860, Lincoln understands that he is a possible presidential nominee. He's not the front runner by any means. He's a long shot, or as we say, a dark horse, but he's up there as a potential nominee. And Lincoln is very ambitious. This is a guy who's always running for office. Usually he loses. He's lost most of the elections he was in, but he's still always trying to get into office. The possibility, because he was very strategically located. He was from Illinois. Illinois was a key state, a doubtful state. As they, in our last elections, the election usually hinges on a couple of states, Ohio in our case, or Florida recently. Illinois was a key. If Lincoln was from Maine, he wouldn't have gotten anywhere because the Republicans had a big majority in Maine. But being in Illinois made you very strategically important because a nominee from Illinois might help to get Illinois into the Republican column. So the Cooper Union speech is designed to show to the East that Lincoln is a plausible nominee. He wasn't really very well known in the East at that time. He was mostly known in Ohio and Illinois and the western states. People had heard about his debates with Stephen A. Douglas, but nobody had seen Lincoln or knew what he looked like or had heard him or anything. So the Cooper Union speech is very important in putting him on the map politically. And, you know, it's an interesting speech. It's a long disquisition. It's like a master's thesis. It has footnotes. When it's published, it has footnotes. It's like a scholarly work. It's about the founding fathers and their views about slavery, and he's got footnotes to their speeches and debates. Very few political speeches have footnotes, you know. But it was carefully worked out to show Lincoln's seriousness. He wasn't just a backwoodsman. He wasn't just a guy from the frontier, a bumpkin, you know. He comes across as a serious thinker about the political crisis of the country. So, yes, I think, but it didn't guarantee his nomination. It just made him more plausible, and it did help get him on the agenda for the Republican convention, which met later on in Chicago. Lincoln was a very lucky guy also. So is President Obama. You know, I mean, luck gets you very far in politics. Obama, who I admire, had the good luck twice to run against completely incompetent opponents. McCain and Romney ran